Professor Chomsky, first question comes from John Berger. Political practice often surprises political vocabulary. For example, the recent revolution in the Middle East is said to demand democracy. Can we find more adequate words? Isn't the use of the old and frequently betrayed words a way of absorbing this shock instead of welcoming it and transmitting it further?
Well, just to begin, I think the word revolution is a bit of an exaggeration. Maybe it'll turn into a revolution, but for the moment it's a call for moderate reform. There are elements in it, like the workers' movement, that are trying to move beyond that, but that remains to be seen. However, his point is correct, but there's no way out of that. It's not just the word democracy, it's every word that is involved in discussion of political affairs has two meanings. It has its literal meaning, has a meaning that's assigned to it for political warfare, for ideology, for doctrine. So either we stop talking or we try to use the words in a sensible way. And it's not just democracy. It's, take the word, a simple word like person. Sounds simple. Take a look at it. In the United States, it's quite interesting. The United States has guarantees of personal rights that go beyond maybe any other country. But have a look at them. The amendments to the Constitution state very explicitly that no person can be deprived of rights, lists the rights, without due process of law. Well, that was, it reappears in the 14th Amendment, it was in the 5th Amendment, and it was intended to apply to freed slaves, but it's never been applied to them. The courts narrowed the meaning and broadened the meaning, crucially. They broadened the meaning to include corporations, fictitious legal entities established by state power. So they were given the rights of persons, by now rights way beyond persons. On the other hand, it was also narrowed because the term persons, you might think, would apply to those creatures walking around who do the dirty work in the society, but don't happen to have documents. And that wouldn't do, because they must be deprived of rights. So the courts, in their wisdom, decided they're not persons. The only persons are people with citizenship. So now non-humans, corporate entities, like the Barclays Bank meeting next door, they're persons with rights way beyond persons, humans. And the people, sweeping the streets are not persons. They don't have rights. And the same is true at just about every term you look at. So take, say, free trade agreements. For example, there's a North American free trade agreement, Canada, the United States, and Mexico. The only accurate term in that is North American. It's certainly not an agreement, at least if human beings are part of their societies, because the population in all three countries was against it. So it's not an agreement. It's not about free trade. In fact, it's highly protectionist. Tremendous protections for monopoly pricing rights for pharmaceutical corporations and so on. A lot of it isn't about trade at all. In fact, what we call trade is a kind of a joke. So, for example, in the old Soviet Union, if parts were manufactured, say, in Leningrad and shipped to Warsaw for assembly and then sold in Moscow, we didn't call that trade, although it did cross national borders. It was interactions within a single command economy. And exactly the same is true if General Motors manufactures parts in Indiana, sends them to Mexico for assembly, and sells them in Los Angeles. But we call that trade both ways. In fact, if you look at the trade, it's about 50% of it, not small. And a lot of the agreement is just about investor rights, say granting General Motors the rights of national companies in Mexico, for example, which Mexicans, of course, don't get in the United States. And you pick the term you want. you're going to find exactly the same thing. So yes, that's a problem, and we get around it by trying to be clear about the way we use our own terminology.
Second questions come from award-winning journalist Chris Hedges. Julien Benda, in the Treason of Intellectuals, argued that it is only when intellectuals are not in the pursuit of practical aims, of material advantages, that they can serve as a conscience and as a corrective. Can you address the loss of philosophers, religious leaders, writers, journalists, artists, and scholars whose lives were once lived in direct opposition to the realism of the multitudes, and what this has meant for our intellectual and moral life?
Well, the only, I understand his feelings and share them, but I don't know what the loss was. When was it ever true? At no time that I can remember. The term intellectual came into pretty common usage in the modern sense at the time of the Dreyfusards. They were a small minority, a small vilified minority. The mass of intellectuals supported state power. During the First World War, shortly afterwards, the intellectuals of every one of the countries passionately supported their own state and its own violence. Now, there were a handful of exceptions, like Bertrand Russell in England, or Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht in Germany, or Eugene Debs in the United States. They were all in jail. They were a margin, and they were imprisoned. Yeah, so yes, they were there. In the John Dewey circle, the liberal intellectuals in the United States, passionately pro-war. There was one member, Randolph Bourne, who didn't go along with it. He wasn't put in jail. The United States is a pretty free country. But he was thrown out of the journals, intellectually exiled and so on. That's the way it's always been. During the, say, 1960s, big activist period, you take a careful look. Intellectuals were very supportive of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement as long as he was attacking somebody else. As long as the civil rights movement was going after racist sheriffs in Alabama, that was wonderful. Everybody praised it, we talked big high rhetoric and so on. As soon as he turned to class issues, he was marginalized and suppressed. People tend to forget that he was killed when he was taking part in a sanitation worker strike and on his way to Washington to help organize a poor people's movement. Well, that crosses the boundary. That goes after us. That goes after privilege in the North and so on. So the intellectuals disappeared. With regard to the Vietnam War, it was exactly the same thing. There was almost no, among known, there was of course people on the fringes, there were young people and so on. But among well-known intellectuals, practically nothing. At the very end, after the Tet Offensive in 1968, when the business community turned against the war, then you started getting drifting of people saying, yes, I was always a long-time anti-war activist, no trace of it or whatever. But that's, in fact, you can take this back to the earliest history. You go back to classical Greece. Who drank the hemlock? A guy who was accused of corrupting the youth of Athens with false gods. Take the biblical records. They didn't have the term intellectual, but they had a term which meant what we mean by intellectual. It's called prophet. It's a bad translation of an obscure Hebrew word. Well, there were so-called prophets, intellectuals, who carried out geopolitical critique, condemned the king for bringing about disaster, condemned the king's crimes, called for mercy for widows and orphans, and so on. What we would call dissident intellectuals. How are they treated? They were denounced as haters of Israel. It's the exact phrase that was used. It's the origins of the phrase self-hating Jew in the modern period. They were imprisoned, driven into the desert, and so on. There were intellectuals who were praised, the flatterers at the court. Centuries later, They were called false prophets, but not at the time. And that's almost the entire history since. There are few exceptions. In the modern period, the one major exception I know is actually Turkey. It's the only country I know where leading prominent artists, academics, journalists, publishers, very broad range of intellectuals, and not only condemn the crimes of the state, but are involved in constant civil disobedience against them, facing, often enduring, pretty severe punishment. I have to laugh when I come to Europe and hear people complaining about how the Turks aren't civilized enough to join our advanced society. You could learn some lessons from Turkey, but that's pretty unusual. In fact, it's so unusual that it's barely known. You can't bring it up. But aside from the word loss, I think Chris Hedges' comments are accurate, but I just can't perceive any loss. I think it's about the same as it's always been. And in fact, the way dissident intellectuals are treated, of course, does vary. So in the United States, let's say, maybe they're vilified or something. In the old Soviet Union, say in Czechoslovakia in the 1960s and 70s, they could be imprisoned, like Havel was in prison. If you were in American domains at that time, like El Salvador, you get your brains blown out by an elite battalion trained in the U.S. Special Warfare School. So yes, people are treated differently, depending on the country.
Third question comes from Israeli journalist Amira Hass. Have the uprisings in the Arab states made you change, revise some of the past evaluations? Have they and how affected your notions of, for example, masses, hope, Facebook, Western intervention, or surprise?
Well, actually, Amira and I met in Turkey a couple of months ago. Had a couple of hours chance to talk. And neither of us, and maybe she did, if she did it was a secret, I certainly didn't anticipate anything that was going to happen in the Arab world. So yes, it changed my opinion in that respect. It was unexpected. On the other hand, when you look back at it, it's not that different from what's happened before, except that in the past, the uprisings were brutally suppressed. And indeed, they were this time too. So the first of the uprisings was actually in November. That was in the Western Sahara, which is occupied by Morocco. 25 years ago, Morocco invaded, violated UN resolutions. It's a brutal occupation. In November, there was a nonviolent protest, which Moroccan troops came in and crushed violently, as they've been doing for 25 years. It was serious enough so that it was brought to the UN for a potential inquiry, but France intervened. France is the primary protector of atrocities and crimes in Western Africa. It's the old French possessions. So they blocked any UN inquiry. That was the first. The next one was in Tunisia, again, more or less French area. And there were scandals, as you know. I think the Minister of Tourism, or one of the ministers, went for a vacation right in the middle of the uprising and got some bad publicity. But that one was successful. It threw out the dictator. Then came Egypt, which is the most important because of its significance in the Arab world. And that was pretty remarkable. It was a remarkable display of courage, dedication, commitment. It did succeed in getting rid of the dictator. It hasn't yet changed the regime. Maybe it will, but the regime is pretty much in place. Different names. But it's nothing new. That uprising, the January 25th uprising, it was led by young people who call themselves the April 6th movement. Well, April 6th has for a reason. April 6th, they picked the name because it was the date of a major strike action a couple of years earlier at the Mahala textile complex, big industrial complex. There was supposed to be a major strike, support activities and so on. Well, they were crushed by violence. That's April 6th. And that's only one of a series. Incidentally, shortly after the crushing of the April 6th uprising, President Obama came to Egypt to deliver his famous address, outreach to the Muslim world and so on. On his way, he was asked at a press conference whether he would say anything about the authoritarian government of President Mubarak. And he said no, he wouldn't. He said Mubarak's a good man, he's doing good things, he's keeping stability, like crushing the April 6th strike and so on, so that's just fine. Then the uprisings went beyond. The most striking one is Bahrain. That's frightening to the West. First of all, because Bahrain hosts the Fifth Fleet, the major military force in the region, U.S. fleet. Second, because it's largely Shia, and it's right across a causeway from eastern Saudi Arabia, which is majority Shiite, and happens to be where most of the oil is. Now that gets frightening. For years, Western planners have been concerned about a kind of a geographical and historical accident. Most of the world's oil is in Shiite areas, right around that part of the Gulf, Iran, southern Iraq, and eastern Saudi Arabia. Well, if the uprising in Bahrain spreads to Saudi Arabia, then Western power is really in trouble. And in fact, Obama has changed the rhetoric of that's used officially for the talk about the uprisings. For a while it was regime change. Incidentally, that's after the uprising succeeded. Then you kind of move in and say, oh, it's fine. Now it's regime alteration. We don't want any change. It's too valuable to have our dictators run things. Actually, a rather striking fact about all of this is that you take a look at the WikiLeaks exposures. It's pretty interesting. The ones that got the most exposure in the West, the big headlines, euphoric commentary, were the leaks from the ambassadors, which said that the Arab world supports us against Iran. Well, one thing was missing in that reaction in the newspapers by the columnists and others, namely Arab opinion. What they meant was the Arab dictators support us. But what about Arab opinion? It's known, but it's not reported. In the United States, zero. There's, I think, one report in England. Jonathan Steele reported it, probably nothing in France. I don't know. But it's well known. Western U.S. polling agencies, released by very prestigious agencies. It turns out that some Arabs think Iran is a threat, about 10%. A majority, a vast majority, think the major threat is the United States and Israel. In Egypt, 90% say the United States is the major threat. In fact, opposition to U.S. policy is so strong that in Egypt, I think it's close to 80% think the region would be better off if Iran had nuclear weapons. Over the whole region, it's a majority. Well, who cares? You know, going back to John Berger's term democracy, Western intellectual contempt for democracy is so profound and deep-seated that it doesn't even occur to anyone to ask, well, what do Arabs think when we are euphoric that the Arabs support us? Well, the answer is it doesn't matter. As long as they're quiet and subdued and controlled, as long as there's what's called stability, it doesn't matter what they think. The dictators support us, period. We're euphoric. Well, okay, that kind of ties together a number of these questions, but going back to Amira Hass's comments, you know, what's happened should lead us to think about what has been happening, not only in the Arab world, but elsewhere, has often arisen and has been subdued by violence. And that's been true for a century. I mean, the British were suppressing democracy movements in Iran over a century ago. In Iraq, there was a Shiite uprising in as soon as the British cobbled the country together after the First World War, big uprising, violently suppressed. One of the first uses of aircraft to attack civilians. In fact, Britain was very proud of that. The famous Lloyd George, Britain succeeded in blocking a disarmament conference in 1932. They prevented it from barring use of aircraft against civilians. Lloyd George, famous Lloyd George, wrote in his diary that this was a great thing because we have to reserve the right to bomb niggers. So therefore it was a very good thing that the British government did. And it continued. In 1953, the United States and Britain combined to throw out the parliamentary government in Iran. In 1936 to 39, there was an Arab uprising in Palestine against the British, violently crushed. The first Intifada was again a very significant popular uprising, almost entirely nonviolent, and a real popular movement. Women's groups attack, protests against the feudal structure, try to dismantle it, and so on. It was crushed by violence. So sure, these things like this happen all the time. They're just crushed. What's unusual this time is that strong enough so it was most of the countries able to sustain itself. What will happen in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, Jordan, we don't know. In fact, we really don't know what will happen in Egypt. The military has so far retained control, and the top military command, at least, is deeply embedded into the old oppressive regime. They own a lot of the economy. They were the beneficiaries of the Mubarak dictatorship. They're not going to give it up easily. So it remains to be seen what happens there.
Next question is from Ken Loach, award-winning filmmaker. How do we overcome sectarianism on the left?
I don't think we'll ever overcome it. For one thing, one form of sectarianism should be welcomed, namely disagreement. There are a lot of things that are quite unclear. We ought to have discussion, disagreement, pursue different options, and so on. But what he means by sectarianism, and what is generally meant by it, is initiatives that sometimes attempt to and often succeed in breaking up popular movements. So individuals or political groups that have their own agenda and want to take control, become little Lenins and so on and so forth. That kind of sectarianism I don't think is ever going to really be suppressed.